This is the next in a series of videos on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I hope you find it useful. Today we're looking at the first section of the poem, The Burial of the Dead. If you haven't seen my previous video on The Wasteland, which largely covered from ritual to romance, I recommend you do so, but I'll also backtrack a little and reference it in this video. At the beginning of the poem we have this epigram, which translates to, "For I myself saw with my own eyes the Cumean Sibyl hanging in a cage, and when the boy said to her, 'Sibyl, what do you want?' she would reply, 'I want to die.'" A Sibyl was a seer priestess in the ancient world. This particular Sibyl was granted one wish by Apollo, and she wished for eternal life, but forgot to stipulate eternal youth. Thus she grows older and smaller. This epigram is related to the poem in a few ways. First, it's from the Satyricon, which exists in fragments, like the Wasteland. Nice little coincidence there. Second, the Sibyl was once a prominent religious figure in the ancient world, but in the context of what's going on around the quote, she's been reduced to a dinner table joke. This theme of degradation will reappear a few times in the poem. Lastly, the Sibyl state is similar as that of the land in the poem, dry, a husk of its former self, yet not dead. Mechanistically, she's alive, but not alive in any natural sense of the term. She wants to die, and this part is especially felt in the first lines and section, so let's try to get there. Next, we have Eliot's dedication to Ezra Pound. Pound was Eliot's editor for The Wasteland. This is its own story, but to explain the Emilio Fabro, this quote, which means the better craftsman, is from the Divine Comedy, in which Dante praises another poet, Arnaud Daniel. So as Dante praised Daniel, Eliot praises Pound. In section 1, we have the title, The Burial of the Dead. If you saw my previous video, I tied this title to the element of earth. In my interpretation, I believe there's an importance in focusing on the elementals in the wasteland. As we'll see, the poem is filled with references to the four elements. While Eliot exercises a strong religious influence, both Judeo-Christian and Buddhist, in the poem, when he acknowledges that to Weston and her book, what he acknowledged was the anthropological, not strictly the religious, at least not the later religious developments, but the primitive, the fertility rituals. The fertility rituals are in the Grail romances, not vice versa. The Grail romances contain the most recent updates to the age-old symbols, for example, lance and cup. Given that these predate Christianity by thousands of years, the lance and cup strike a deeper chord than the spear of destiny and the Holy Grail. The Wasteland would have been a very different poem if it had featured or heavily featured characters and elements from the romances, in my opinion. Eliot, being as masterful as he is, would have probably found a way to make this work. Even so, in our secular world, the Grail romances, their figures and symbols overtly don't have a place. I believe this is partly why E.A. Robinson's epic poems like Merlin and Tristan failed. Even with Robinson's Arthur poems having modern undertones, they're out of touch with the rhythm and beat of the times. Remember this for later. Or at least Robinson's Arthur poems sound a bit antiquated. And here the ways of God again are mixed, for this new knight who is to find the Grail for you, and for the least who pray for you, and such lost combs and hollows of the world, as you have never entered, is to be the son of him you trusted, Lancelot. The grandeur of figures like Lancelot and Arthur is lost on us, at least our modern sensibilities, and it's not simply figures from the romances, but elements not even limited to their worlds. For example, the horse has been a staple of civilization for hundreds of years. King Arthur and his knights went around on horseback. What role does the horse have in the world of the sounds of horns and motors, and like a taxi throbbing, waiting? In the modern city, the horse, its worlds, would be seen as antiquated. Now the horse isn't completely gone. Rather, it's been made new with the invention of the automobile. The pride persons have felt for their horses have been replaced with the pride we feel for our cars. But still, speaking of horses, or writing poetry in the worlds where the horse as a horse is still valued in the age of horsepower would be antiquated, at least by early 20th century standards. As an aside, if you've read Henderson's essay in Jung, Man and His Symbols, these age-old symbols never go away. For example, the bird and what it symbolizes, its living force, is made new and symbolized by the airplane or rocket. Elsewhere in the book, the dragon by the train, etc. I repeat this phrase, made new, because it's another theme of the Wasteland, the modernist dictum, make it new, one I'll cover in more depth in section 3, although it does have relevance too in this section. Again, the grandeur of Grail romance figures is lost on us. It reminds me a bit of Don Quixote when he begins his adventures, announcing himself as a knight in all his armor, and the utter bewilderment across the faces of those he meets. Not the human tendencies for romances, but the time of romances has passed. We live in a modern world, like in Don Quixote or the Wasteland, or more safely put, the modern age is very different from the age of romances or the Romantic period. At the end of my previous video, I quoted Weston's "The Grail is a living force, it will never die," but I also quoted that the wasteland functions more as a from romance to ritual. When I heard this phrase, from romance to ritual, years ago, it resonated with my attempts to make sense of the poem. I'll try to justify this interpretation in this and the following videos. My from romance to ritual take means reading the poem as a return to these primitive elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, yet it's not a naturalistic return, which I'll explain in a moment. Why return to the basic elements, not the romances? First, remember Eliot's the mythic method and the historical sense that I cited in the previous video. In The Wasteland, Eliot's adhering to an older tradition to give shape to his own expression, but as also covered in the previous video, the older tradition is the fertility rituals, not the Grail romances, which contain the fertility rituals. Here's a quote for more insight. "The artist, I believe, is more primitive as well as more civilized than his contemporaries. His experience is deeper than civilization, and he only uses the phenomena of civilization in expressing it. The Grail romances aren't primitive enough to give voice to this deeper experience, because the lance and cup symbols are more deeply embedded in the psyche than the Holy Grail and the Spear of Destiny. After all, it's the former pair that give the latter pair their living forces. Secondly, since not all of us are Christian, there's always the danger from the poet's perspective that the Grail romances may not strike a chord in us. This goes for other religious tales like the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, pick whatever you like. While these stories and stories like them have universal appeal, this doesn't always translate to universal significance. Can we say the same thing about water? Our bodies are mostly water. What about fire? It's associated with the sun. We need fire for warmth. Earth? We're animals, not robots, so we need nutrition from a fertile earth. Wind's also important, meteorologically as well for fertilization. Keep in mind these symbols aren't absolutely positive. For example, wind and fire have negative associations across cultures in a way that's rarer or not as immediate as for water and earth. Regardless, the four elements have universal significance for us. This cannot be denied by any human. Yet it's not a simple significance nor a secular one. If we think about our basic animals, dogs, cats, squirrels, rodents, monkeys, birds, etc., they're dependent on these elements as much as we are, but for animals, these elements have no religious significance. It's different for us. In her book From Ritual to Romance, Weston talks about the element of water with its religious significance, and you can see my previous video on this for more information. In The Wasteland, as in the fertility rituals, water is largely good, the same largely with literary allusions to water. In the poem, this is to be contrasted with fire, as in the dry land the fertility rituals try to relieve, the same with literary allusions to fire. The pattern is similar enough, the poem looking at both the natural world and the human world, but since the land is in waste or infertile, this translates the sterility or sterile acts in the human world. But to try to return to the poem by way of Weston's quote, now modified, it's not the Grail that is the living force. The Grail as the Grail can lose its force. It can die. When was the last time you thought about the Holy Grail? Instead, the living force in the Grail, represented by the Grail. It is what cannot die. The long established or longer established cup symbol, and in line with the cup, the four elements. They also carry the same force, in particular water and what it symbolizes. And again, see my previous video, which is timestamped, for more information about the long-standing spiritualistic importance of water. Consider this quote. The more useful poetry socially would be one which can cut across all present stratifications of public taste, stratifications which are perhaps a sign of social disintegration. And the author of a work of imagination is trying to affect us wholly, as human beings, whether he knows it or not, and we are affected by it, as human beings, whether we intend it to be or not. This is how, in my opinion, Eliot wrote a more universal poem. By including the elements and using them so simply, he created poetry that cuts through civilization, or all types and tiers of civilization, and affects us wholly as human beings. Because these elements go deeper than society, and our need for them is something that we haven't or probably can't ever evolve past. This effect is at its strongest in certain lines in section 1 and section 5 of the poem, so let's get there. So in the title, with its reference to the Anglican Book of Prayer, we have our earth symbol, yet with a religious tie-in. The religious begins the poem, and it'll end the poem. In my copies of The Wasteland, I cross-reference words and ideas by putting the corresponding line numbers. I'll share these cross-references with the text itself on screen. Some of these connections I'll provide some explanation of, but not all. Some I'll explain once I get far enough into the poem, then backtrack. But any line numbers don't correspond to the shown text placement, but other lines of text. Let's look at our first lines. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. April is the cruelest month. What does this mean? There are two things, both of which are relevant throughout the poem. The line is an allusion to the general prologue from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. However, in Chaucer, spring is a welcomed event, as it is with most peoples. In The Wasteland's most memorable lines, like this one, when Eliot's alluding to another work, he does so ironically, which means subverting the quote, its context, or both. A core idea to keep in mind moving forward. Also, in relation to the general prologue, and this is an observation made by Sultan in his book, Eliot, Joyce and Company, note the word pilgrimages. Just as there's a pilgrimage at the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, so is there in the wasteland a quester going through the land in search of the Holy Grail, or the cup, or something of spiritual significance. As of the poem's opening, it's open-ended as to what he or she could be looking for if we decide to note the word pilgrimages. The question of a quester in the poem is not something I'm going to cover, or I'll only cover it a bit towards the end. I'll talk about why when we get to the poem's final sections. For now, let's take it for granted that there is a person taking up the quest or going through the wasted land. Why is spring cruel? In subverting our expectation, the line gets us thinking. Eliot felt a strong spiritual and intellectual connection to the metaphysical poets. Felt I should have done an entire video on the metaphysical poets as background for the wasteland. Hopefully very briefly touching on some core ideas in Eliot's words from his The Metaphysical Poets essay will be sufficient. Donne and often Cowley employed a device which is sometimes considered characteristically metaphysical. The elaboration contrasted with the condensation of the figure of speech to the farthest stage to which ingenuity can carry it. Some of Donne's most successful and characteristic effects are secured by brief words and sudden contrasts. Johnson, who employed the term metaphysical poets apparently having Donne, Cleveland, and Cowley in mind, remarks of them that the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. The force of this impeachment lies in the failure of their conjunction, the fact that often the ideas are yoked but not united. Metaphysical poetry often links two disparate things, such as spring and cruelty, and it's up to us to figure it out. It's important to remember that while the two things are linked or yoked, they are not united. The disparity remains, thus our confoundment. Metaphysical poetry is thinking poetry, and Eliot was influenced by metaphysical poetry. The metaphysical poetry likeness of Eliot's poetry isn't an arbitrary stylistic choice, nor used as a means of showing off his ingenuity. The modern period seemingly demands it, according to Eliot. We can only say that it appears likely that poets in our civilization, as it exists at present, must be difficult. Our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity playing upon a refined sensibility must produce various and complex results. For Eliot, it would be false, inconsistent, or disingenuous for poetry to go back to previous less complex styles. Back to our question, why is spring cruel? Our first clue was in the epigram. Remember the Sibyl who wants to die? Spring brings dead things back to life. The Sibyl already has life, but only mechanistically. In the poem, the land being in waste, people, as we will see, going through the motions of life, being closer to the sterility rather than the fertility side of things. They have enough life, maybe even have had enough of life. They want death. It would be better for death to be final, but April spring undoes death. The next word, breeding, it almost tells us all we need to know. Breeding is mechanistic, like mixing and stirring. Breeding suggests the motions of reproduction, foreshadowing for later. Breeding is a terrible way to describe nature. Certainly, fertilization and reproduction are also mechanistic, but breeding is this and also negative. Pests breed. Here, nature, life, is a pest, because what is wanted is death, or if life is seen as a pest, seemingly death is what is valued. Mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. This is our theme for this section. Most of the lines in section 1 have to do with looking back to the past, the desire for the past, or nostalgia. The memories are stirred up by spring. Spring and rain are reminders of how things used to be, young and vivacious, and the dull roots are the dreary inner lives of the present people experiencing nostalgia. Winter kept us warm, another metaphysical poetry line. What does it mean? If these people want death, note the us, and winter is interpreted as a positive thing, something that brings warmth, then winter would be a substitute for death, yet a poor substitute because it's 1. Not substantive, i.e. snow melts, and 2. Spring eventually arrives, hence April being cruel. Winter isn't a permanent death. Even so, winter hides life, vitality, past reminders. Furthermore, winter kept us warm has a physiological psychoanalytic interpretation, this line possibly portraying hypothermia, the warm feeling of dying in the snow, or the warmth that one feels before one dies in the snow. This is supported if we take the next line covering, earth and forgetful snow, as evoking the imagery of a bed being kept warm by the cover, the white cover, over one like in a bed. But the warmth it brings is death. Two other things about the white cover. First, the white cover is more akin to what you would put over a corpse or find in a morgue, not the top layer of one's bed, yet still consistent with the death theme. Second, the words snow and cover connect with frost and bed in line 73, around which more vegetation imagery is in, and around the lines we're examining now. So the words warm, cover, and bed might suggest some eroticism, and with the previous connections with death, the us in this line might have death wishes. I do think this is a bit tenuous. We have a clause in the next line qualifying how to interpret winter kept us warm. Also, this psychoanalytic view was one that formed only after reading Schubert's Winterreise, the Der Lindenbaum section, and Mann's The Magic Mountain, specifically the snow chapter. For those unfamiliar with these works, snow, resting in the snow, is connected with the death wish. Even if Eliot was familiar with Winterreise, he need not have been familiar with this work to suggest this, and The Magic Mountain had not been published yet. I'll come back to this view in a moment, but I don't believe it's central to section 1. Covering earth in forgetful snow. Now some counter that fall comes before winter, so why wouldn't snow cover up decay, not the life of summer and spring? Yes, life is in decay in the wasteland. Snow covers up decay in two senses. First, it helps the nostalgic forget decay, because snow is beautiful, white, and pure, bringing to mind beautiful memories of youth, like Marie playing in the mountains. But what's also white and pure and in contrast with decay beautiful? Bones. Some more foreshadowing here. Hence death. If interpreted correctly, the snow on the ground would connect with the white bodies and bones on the ground in lines 193 to 194 later. As to why this reveal, it could be for a number of reasons, from showing what's underneath the warmth, psychoanalytic, to revealing actual dead bodies of those in the trenches from World War I after the snow melts, historical. This aside, second, April is cruel because those in the wasteland want death, and again, winter is a substitute for death, or as close as it can get. One more comment about the snow. If we remember, water is crucial to the fertility rituals, thus even if the land is in a bad way, the solution would be the same. Water. Now, water shouldn't be taken so literally. It has a living force, a spiritualism attached to it embedded in the human psyche. But in the wasteland, the previously mentioned us, their desires are for death. Yet I would argue that even here, water's spiritual meaning or healing symbolism cannot be eliminated. Thus, how snow is a poor substitute for death, snow is a poor substitute for water. Its life-giving force is frozen, but is still there, subconsciously being desired by those who want death. Much of what I've provided is simply food for thought. There are other readings and meanings to what we've looked at so far. This all speaks to the poem's richness. This is a general idea regarding literature. The deeper it goes, the richer and more variety of interpretations it offers. The more surface it is, the more one-dimensional, thus the less it offers. As Eliot says, the poet is occupied with frontiers of consciousness, beyond which words fail, though meanings still exist. A poem may appear to mean very different things to different readers, and all these meanings may be different from what the author thought he meant. There may be much more in a poem than the author was aware of. The ambiguities may be due to the fact that the poem means more, not less, than ordinary speech can communicate. Feeding a little life to dry tubers is not as extreme as breeding, but feeding it is more bland than a wood-like nourishing, which would be more in line with the natural needs of plant life, going from winter to spring. And the little life from dry tubers connects with the dull roots and the poem's epigram. The next line, summer surprised us coming over the Starnberger set, and with the shower rain we stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the hop garden and drank coffee and talked for an hour. With the shower rain and the Starnberger set, we have what nostalgia remembers, also hints of water. The summer coming as a surprise is interesting, either the people's wanting to hold on to their winter, or an indication of the beginning of youth's end. The hop garden, apart, acts as a bridge between the rain and the Starnbergersee, and the colonnade coffee and talk earmarked to civilization. So we're moving away from the elements and into civilization, so what's something a civilized person would say? Den gar keine Russen stammen aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. So there's some bickering over ethnic identity. Someone was mistaken for a Russian who were stereotyped as uncivilized. See Eliot's note on lines 367 to 376, who he or she was in fact German, a true German supposedly. Our next lines, and when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took us out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went. In the mountains there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. And when we were children again, nostalgia. The Archduke is a remnant of an old order, one of many things that disappears in stature and significance in the 20th century. That Marie qualifies him as a relation might hint at her snobbery. As to who Marie is, it's most commonly believed that Marie is a reference to Countess Marie Larisch von Moynich. There's a short essay called Marie, Marie, Hold On Tight by George L.K. Morris, who makes some connections between the events in her memoirs and a dozen events in the wasteland if you're interested. The last two lines suggest she's oppressed with the feeling of not being free, and just as she withdraws to the mountains, she also withdraws to the south to suit her. Our next lines, what are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of the stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. I'd like to share this quote from Eliot. I believe that the poet naturally prefers to write for as large and miscellaneous audience as possible, and that it is the half-educated and ill-educated, rather than the uneducated, who stand in the way. I myself should like an audience which can neither read nor write. In a play of Shakespeare, you get several levels of signification. Earlier I stated that Eliot uses elementals in order to evoke a universal significance in the poem, and I believe this is one of the first places where he achieves this. There are allusions here to Old Testament texts, but I won't cite every single allusion in the poem. Any standard copy or critical edition of The Wasteland does this for you. Notice, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. You don't have to be proficient in poetry to appreciate or feel this. You could seemingly be illiterate and the poem could affect you as deeply as it does the most educated T.S. Eliot scholar, or the scholarship might even get in the latter's or reformer's way. Eliot achieves this through simple images, simple constructs, and yet does so powerfully. It's not solely Eliot who's at work, it's also the basic images, roots, branches, cricket, no shelter, dry stone, no sound of water. And this isn't naturalism, only someone at the mercy of pure and indifferent nature. There's a spiritual context in the background of this dry landscape. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. It and the next lines up till line 30 really read like something out of the prophets' literature, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and wisdom literature, Job, Ecclesiastes, from which the imagery is drawn. I'll share a few Old Testament quotes on screen now. With this in mind, I'd like to briefly categorize lines 19 through 24 as belonging to Old Testament prophets and their context, and lines 24 through 30 as belonging to wisdom from the Old Testament wisdom literature. Now, why is the land in such a bad state? If we look at the prophets' literature, we have following. All that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from me shall be written into the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters. I, the Lord, have brought down the high tree, have exalted the low tree, have dried up the green tree, and have made the dry tree to flourish. I, the Lord, have spoken and done it. And I lay it waste, it shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briers and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For my people they have committed two evils, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and have hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Therefore the showers have been withholden, and there hath been no latter rain. In the Old Testament the land is in waste in consequence of transgressions against the Lord. If this sounds somewhat familiar, it is because it's not unlike the relationship between the Fisher King and the land, covered in my previous video. If the Fisher King died, the land died. In the Old Testament text, the Lord is dead in the hearts of the house of Judea, therefore the land dies. It's not quite the same as the relationship between the Fisher King and the land, yet keep in mind that there we're dealing with primitive religions, while the Old Testament spiritualism is more developed. Before I provide the corresponding wisdom literature quotes for lines 24 to 30, let's look at lines 24 to 30 first. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear and a handful of dust. Put the divide at line 24 because from what are the roots to no sound of water, there as well as line 23 states no relief. But at line 24's end we have a qualifying remark, the word only, up till, and it's rather apropos, a handful of dust. More importantly, there's something to be revealed, the I will show you something different. Now the relief in lines 25 to 6 is prior to what will be shown, this revelation, which I'd argue is some form of wisdom. Let's look at the Old Testament literature for some context, especially since the language or imagery is similar enough. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow. They are wet with the showers of the mountains and embrace the rock for want of a shelter. He satteth into darkness, and searcheth out all perfection, the stones of darkness, and the shadow of death. The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? The shady trees cover him with their shadow, the willows of the brook compass him about. For who knoweth what is good for a man in his life, all the days of his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow? For who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? Who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? Then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, farther, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. Again, first the relief, then the revelation. The red rock brings a bit of relief, but what is the red rock? When I was first intrigued by the poem and read the Wasteland scholarship, I never found a satisfactory explanation for the red rock. Instead, one day I was watching Stargate, and the plot device for season 10 was the Arthurian quest stories, including a search for the Song Graal. And it wasn't until the moment the show showed the Song Graal as this red stone that it hit me, the shadow under this red rock. I got online, and sure enough, a variation of the Holy Grail, our cup symbol from the fertility rites, is a red stone, which, like the Grail, was supposed to have healing properties. And Weston does mention stones in connection with the cup. It is further to be noted that besides the dove and fish, the Syrians reverenced stones, more especially meteoric stones, which they held to be endowed with life potency and another point of contact with our romance. As to why the rock is red, red is the color of life, of health. Notice with certain red birds, the redder the bird, the healthier it's supposed to be, the more likely it's to attract a mate. Certain monkeys who are capable of providing red meat to their females are more likely to have females who produce healthier offspring. With humans, someone anemic is lacking color. Think about the scene in Schindler's List where the women in the camps prick themselves so as to draw blood and use the blood to give some color to their faces so as to avoid the selection. They did this so as to look healthier. We describe someone as sanguine who has a healthier, positive outlook on life. There's at least a root connection in sangral. Most Romance language speakers will recognize the sang root, which means blood. There's also a more pictorially obvious answer. It's red because the red stone or jewel is like a heart. If you look at the language of the Old Testament prophets' literature, much of it speaks of the Lord's hearts, the prophets' hearts, and the people's hearts. Also notice the red rock isn't limited to strictly a purely religious meaning. It's not the Holy Grail, searching for the grail that provides one respite in this harsh land. If it was, this would come across as overhanded. Again, not all readers of the Wasteland are Christian. In this dry land, someone takes relief from the elements under a red rock, and this is something anyone can appreciate, Christian or not. Even so, there is a religious meaning behind this piece of nature, and seemingly a reader would get the most out of it by at least appreciating this, or he or she might even do so without fully knowing because it's a variation of a symbol, the cup, embedded in the psyche. As for the wisdom, the red rock has something to show whoever this address is addressed to, presumably the quester. What the red rock reveals is not a message of love or anything more representative of Christian development. This fear and a handful of dust is our mortality. Dust is a traditional symbol, probably the oldest of our mortal coil. Naturally, this strikes one with fear, with its I hold you in my hand gesture, and what I hold in my hand is nothing meaning. Compare this with the mention of shadow. When we think of a shadow, we think of a dark image cast by something of substance. If it has substance, it has a shadow. Before we had ideas, probably the most real things for primitive man were things in nature, anything that casts a shadow. That it casts a shadow is an indication of a thing's reality. Naturally, we cast shadows, and the more erect we are, the longer our shadows. Notice the language, the morning striding and the evening rising. Symbolically, the morning and striding belong to youth, the evening to decline. The rising is actually negative because it's the darkness that's rising, even better than you, again, decline. Similar to the language in Isaiah, depending on your translation, where the grave is described as opening up to meet you, I believe. At noon, at your highest or zenith, you don't cast a shadow. Notice what also doesn't cast a shadow. Dust. Even at our highest, we are nothing, or we can fit under the shadow of a rock. Next we have Frisch werd die Wind, der Heimat zu, mein neidisch Kind, wo weilest du? From Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, in this scene another allusion to water. Here Isolde is being taken by a ship to Mark of Cornwall, the king. The lines are sung by a sailor on the ship, so we return to our theme of section 1, nostalgia. At least I do believe this is a memory, not part of the quester's pilgrimage. The transition is a rather positive one in line with the water element. It being a song also feeds into nostalgia. It seems to function like remembering a song from better or earlier days, especially since it's about love. That love intrudes or how it intrudes is something I've never made up my mind on how to interpret. If we take the previous lines when shown on mortality, we might have a knee-jerk reaction to remember better days, trying to be consistent with what I've presented so far. If snow represents a poor substitute for water, here we have finally a healthy water scene, love and water, contrasted with previously death and snow. These lines are followed by another reference to water. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed me. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence. Odun leer das Meer. Again, another memory and nostalgia. At first it starts off pleasant enough, yet even before we get to the yet, the hyacinth is a flower of rebirth but also death. Hyacinth was killed by Apollo, and the flower is in memoriam of a dead love. With the yet, the tone becomes either ominous or dramatic. Ominous because the I could not speak, I was neither living nor dead is reminiscent of Dante in the last circle of hell when he sees the devil. Dramatic because maybe the speaker's experiencing a heightened feeling of love, in which everything around her becomes reduced to where she can experience the silence. But even if we interpret it positively, the next line, also from Tristan and Isolde, hints to how we should interpret this memory. The text translates to, "Desolate and empty is the sea." For context, towards the opera's end, Tristan is dying and waiting for Isolde and her ship. Tristan asks a watchman if he can see her ship on the horizon, and the watchman tells him the sea is empty. How I think these lines work is that the quester is trying to remember something positive, but nostalgia is only good for so long. Eventually the memory has to fail, and you return to reality. If we interpret the second half of the Hyacinth Girl's speech as negative, we can see the memories failing. How this memory of love, even in the memory, leads to unhappiness. No love. At least an escape into one's memory serves nothing. Coincidentally enough, if we believe the quester is remembering this in the landscape of where the sun beats under the shadow of this red rock, there is no water around him or her, and in a sense, in the memory too, the sea is empty. I think that whatever happened with the Hyacinth Girl, it didn't turn out well, yet as to how this love failed, it's difficult to know. One final comment. Notice the Hyacinth Girl memory is bridged between a line from Act 1 and a line from Act 3 of Wagner's opera. Given Tristan and Isolde being a tragedy, and our traditional tragic play structure, it starts off well and ends tragically, as with the lines Eliot inserted here. Coincidentally, Mark of Cornwall and Tristan are waiting for Isolde's love, in Act 1 and 3 respectively, yet the love never arrives, at least not in the way each expected. It's as if the Hyacinth Girl memory is Act 2, or the act in which the lovers unite in a traditional play, yet it doesn't matter how it started, or that we don't understand entirely what's going on in this Act 2, it will still end tragically. Next, lines 43 to 59. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold. Nevertheless is known to be the wisest woman in Europe with a wicked back of cards. "Here," she said, "is your card, the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look. Here is Belladonna, the lady of the rocks, the lady of situations. Here is the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel. And here is the one-eyed merchant. And this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I am forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. Fear death by water. I see crowds of people walking round in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Miss Equitone, tell her I'll bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days." In my first video, I mentioned the sage figure from the romances. The sage is the wise person who helps the quester on his or her journey. In this video, I mentioned degradation, how Eliot takes something elevated and brings it low. There are 2 sage figures in the wasteland, and Madame Sosostris is the first. She may be famous and known to be the wisest, but she's a sham. If Eliot still wanted us to have the prophets' literature in mind, the prophets called out false diviners often enough. She's our Merlin figure, but very far removed from Merlin. Our first indication of something amiss is that she has a cold and sick. I think 100 years ago when the poem was written, a cold was still associated with cold weather or cold water, like the imagery in the first lines of this section. The second is that the cards are described as wicked. This is rather telling because of the alliteration connection in wisest and wicked, possibly another clue to the false diviners from the Old Testament prophet books. Wicked does not mean awesome, but unholy. Of course, if correct, it's subtle. FYI, unlike Yeats, Eliot did not have a positive opinion of mediums. But this is another story. What does the Madam reveal? The addressee's card is the drowned Phoenician sailor, another reference to one's mortality. Just because Madame Sosostris is a sham, that doesn't mean everything she says is wrong. A hint of this is her name, Sosostris, as in so-so in her predictions, sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But the reference to one's mortality in the drowned Phoenician sailor card does parallel with the end of section 4, death by water, and Madame Sosostris' words, fear death by water. The question becomes, if water is a good thing, a life symbol, how does it lead to death? Although Madame Sosostris is a sham, she can see the mortal side of things, the secular dangers and the search, the biggest danger being death. She can't see the spiritual significance or the higher. Also, remember an origin of tarot was to predict the rise and falls of water, cited in my previous video. So there's a subversion of a central aspect of her art and purpose. Given that water is what is needed, whether interpreted literally or spiritually, and she's leading the quester away from it, this could strike one as ominous, or, the word Eliot used, wicked. Or in between the sailor card and this card, which is blank, she can see the man with 3 staves. This is an actual tarot card, which is tied to the Fisher King, although if Eliot intends something else here, the man with 3 staves could also or really be a reference to Christ and the criminals at Golgotha, but she can't see it or can't see beyond the tarot. The wheels are reference to the traditional symbol of fortune, but you don't have to be a seer to see this. Next is a bit of irony. The next card is the One-Eyed Merchant. As a seer, she can see more. She sees a card of someone who can't fully see, but she who can see more can't see what's next, the blank card. This is to be contrasted with the other seer at line 219 and 229. Either because she's a sham or wicked, the card is blank and she can't see what he carries on his back, the cross. Not only this, but she's forbidden to see it. Unlike the other sage figure in the poem, she has limits or can only see one side of things. Also, she doesn't find the Hanged Man, or Christ. Yet again, Eliot isn't overhanded. The Hanged Man is the Fisher King. The identification works up to this point, but the reader can go beyond. Finally, our third indication that she's a sham is at the closing. The horoscope, by which she means the one in the newspaper, is her competition. Interestingly enough, if we compare the imagery of the tarot and the newspaper, the former is a two-dimensional object, like the latter. They're both flat. And given Eliot's dislike of mediums, he might be hinting at the flat spirituality found in both tarot and newspaper horoscopes. The modernists didn't have a high opinion of newspapers, so there's this too. In our final lines of section 1, Unreal City. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed under London Bridge. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where Mary St. Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. The Unreal City is a reoccurring motif, so keep out of it. As for what it is, let's look briefly at the work it's drawn from, Baudelaire's Les Sept Vieillards. The allusion is to the first line, but let's skip it for this part. His like followed him, beard, eye, back, staff, rags, nothing distinguished, come from the same hill. The centurion twin and these spectres walked with the same step towards an unknown goal. Of what famous scheme was I the butt? Or what ill chance humiliated me? Full 7 times from minute to minute, I saw this old man multiply himself. While Baudelaire's depiction of city life is more bitter, Eliot's, who was describing something similar enough, is more damning. Also notice the lack of distinction of the man than men in Baudelaire's poem and in Eliot's lines. The modern man is a mass man, and if we go back to line 57, this is not something unique to men, given the name of Miss Equitone. FYI, this observation of Sosostris and Equitone is based on the annotated footnotes and the annotated Wasteland with Eliot's contemporary prose. Keep in mind how allusions to Baudelaire's poetry begins and ends this section, because Baudelaire takes note of a particular defect in modern man, and one which Eliot won't disagree with. The modernist dictum was pounds make it new. In the next lines, Eliot took something old, Dante's Inferno, and made it new. The crowd is an allusion to Dante and of those he sees in hell, who were neither good nor bad, and he likens this crowd to the morning commuters of London on their way to work. So modern life in the city is likened to hell. With the eyes fixed before their feet, commuters are going to work with defeated spirits. The sighs, short and infrequent, is another Dante allusion to those in the first circle of hell, or limbo. If we go back to line 56, Madame Sosostris says she sees a crowd of people walking around in a ring. She can't see anything higher, but she can see the lower. What she sees is people in hell, not literally but figuratively or spiritually. This vision of hers, however, also links to another line in the poem to be touched on in a later video. The dead sound in the final stroke gives the impression of a bell tolling for the dead, like the title of the section, The Burial of the Dead. This is something I only relatively recently noticed. Solely looking at section 1, we already have half of the fertility rituals mythology pattern. Notice in line 2 we have the dead land, then at line 23 the dead tree, and at lines 62 to 63 dead men. It's an echo of what the primitive peoples believed. When the land dies, the vegetation dies. When the vegetation dies, then the people die. I think the Inferno also serves 2 purposes here. For those who haven't read the Inferno, Dante has to traverse hell to get to heaven, a higher spiritual reality. For those who read the Wasteland as a quest for the higher, there is support here and in the final section. Also, if modern civilization is like hell, it would make sense to encounter those in the outer circles early, like Dante does in his poem. Before we look at the second purpose, here's the final text for this section. Then I saw one I knew and stopped them, crying, Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Malai, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. Second purpose is keeping with the Inferno. In the Inferno, Dante comes across people he recognizes in hell without his being subjected to damnation. His saying, hey, I know you, hence identifying someone, is not a pleasant address, especially with the name Stetson, a type of hat. It would be like calling someone tie clip or handbag. Yes, it's a sign of civilization, but that's all it is now, a sign. Or his sign of civilization distinguishes him more than his character or lack of character. Despite the contemporaneity, Stetson is now linked with the Battle of Malai. There's no consensus as to what what this exactly means, like other lines in the poem. In my opinion, based on the notes in the annotated Wasteland with Eliot's contemporary prose, the Battle of My is actually a sign of progress, because of the potential of opening up commercial routes by sea being part of the basis for the First Punic War. So it's a sign of civilization, or a sign of progress. Yet when you look past the sign, what's really there is death and destruction. This is how it's similar to the Stenson hat. Sure, the person might appear more civilized with it on, or with such a name, but if you look past it, the person is still in hell. It reminds me of the story of the lost Italian commercial pilot. Before going the story, it ends with him getting on the intercom and saying, "The bad news is we don't know where we're going. The good news is we're getting there in record time." Remember this story when we get to the illusion in section 1's final line. Anyway, whether hundreds of years ago or in Eliot's time, these signs are illusory. Also, Eliot will place things from the past and the present together to create a jarring effect. The corpse in the garden is another reference to the Fisher King. In my last video, I covered the major parts of Weston's from ritual to romance. Eliot was also indebted to Fraser, who I didn't cover. Weston does mention the buried god in her book, but it's Fraser's work who goes into much more detail about the buried god. Basically, the god was buried in effigy for fertility. In the poem, it's doubtful whether this will yield anything because of the frost, like the snow at section 1's beginning, or because of the dog. Now, the dog who's friend to men is another enigmatic line with no consensus as to how to interpret it. The line that alludes to reads, "Keep the wolf hence, that's foe to men." For my part, I read the change from wolf to dog as the domestication of an instinct of ours. This change naturally changing foe to friend. What the wolf digs up is for an immediate payoff, and it has no standard of expectations being undomesticated. But the dog, with half a sight in civilization, should know better and perhaps let things be. Another interpretation I like given the irony is that the dog represents the anthropologist who, though domesticated by civilization, digs up the buried god in a civilized way. It should allow it to remain buried to reap the god's primitive benefits that cannot be conferred by anthropology. Regardless, digging up the corpse ensures barrenness, denying the rebirth of the buried god, or at least digging up something that's dead. Finally, the last line. "You hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère." An allusion to another Baudelaire poem, O Lecteur, about the decadence of civilization. I won't share the entire poem. In fact, I won't even read everything from the lines I intend to share. Each day we take another step to hell, descending through the stench, unhorrified. We steal in passing whatever joys we can, squeezing the driest orange all the more. And when we breathe, that hollow rasp is death, sliding invisibly down into our lungs. If the dull canvas of our wretched life is unembellished with such pretty wear as it is because our soul's too weak to dare. There's one supremely hideous and impure, soft-spoken, not the type to cause a scene. How well you know this fastidious monster, reader. Hypocrite reader, you, my double, my brother. First, the lost Italian commercial pilot reminds me of the first two lines. More importantly, as unflattering a portrait as this is, it's not evil, and this is Baudelaire's criticism. Eliot, who wrote an essay on Baudelaire, shares this near the essay's end. I think that Baudelaire has perceived that what distinguishes the relations of man and woman from the copulation of the beasts is the knowledge of good and evil. So far as we are human, what we do must either be good or evil. So far as we do evil or good, we are human, and it is better in a paradoxical way to do evil than to do nothing. At least we exist. It is true to say that the glory of man is his capacity for salvation. It is also true to say that his glory is his capacity for damnation. This is relevant to the final lines and final line of section 1 because the crowd is neither good nor evil, putting it on the level of animals who have no morals. They just exist, which is seemingly worse. But as the final line warns, for those reading the poem, you are reading it as if it doesn't apply to you. This concludes our look at section 1. In the next video, we'll look at the poem's next section, A Game of Chess. If you found this video helped your understanding of the Wasteland, please consider giving it a like and joining me next time.